Thank you, Su Young, and appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. Opportunity provided by INE. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I really look forward to having a good discussion after my talk is over. A lot of you are associated with INE, and you might know Todd Rubalt, who puts together a presentation on how to give a presentation. And what does he say? He says, well, the best talk ever, how to become a science presentation superstar. He says, manage your introduction, which I'm not doing very well. Make a splash, 1 point per slide. Try to use no bullet points. I'm not going to do that. Ask for feedback. I'll do that. You're up on the stage. Don't hide behind the podium and dare to inspire. And so I'll try to do that. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell a story. I'm hoping it'll be a story like the wind. It'll come from afar and it'll touch you. Probably won't just be one story, but it'll be multiple stories. This is a slide I took 25 years ago when I was in Somalia. The fellow who's talking to the group, his name is Hussein. And I still work with him today. He's a colleague. I was with him in Somaliland back in January of this year, and again in Nairobi during the month of August. And we're working on issues related to Somalian agriculture. The students you see in front of him were my colleagues. Those were people that I was working with while in Somalia doing dryland agricultural research. The crop in the background is sorghum. And I bring out this slide because I want to point out the fellow standing right here where you see the pointer. His name is Abdullahi Genyo. He was my counterpart. He was my closest colleague while working for almost 3 years in Somalia. His story is kind of interesting. He could have gone on for a master's while he was working with me, but he stayed around, stayed a little too long. And I left in '88. In 1990, the government was under pressure. There was bombing going on by the government, and a bomb fell in the compound where he lived and actually killed him and his child. So bad outcome. This is another fellow, Adna Soble. He's in front of a cowpea field. You see him. He worked on cowpeas and mung beans, and he actually identified a variety of mung bean that still today is being grown in Somalia, thanks to some efforts to keep that particular crop alive. He also was killed. In his case, he was killed directly by a military person who wanted his barrel of petrol that he had in his vehicle that he was taking to an agricultural research farm. He was employed by the Ministry of Agriculture of the government at that time. The military person was employed by the government at that time, and they had a conflict. He wanted Aden's barrel of diesel, and he ended up getting it and killing Aden in the process. So yeah, maybe, hopefully I got your attention about this issue. What you probably haven't looked at and paid any attention to is the black soil in the background. That's a vertisol soil, highly productive soil when managed correctly. And it's one of the stories that I'll be focusing on today is how do we know how to manage correctly our agroecosystems? So, title, Aggregating an Agroecosystem. What's that all about? And what's this about novel approaches to teaching and learning? Well, dare to shine. Here's an example of where I was shining. I was on a bicycle ride across the continent of Africa. Did this in 2009. While doing that bicycle ride, I was teaching a class back here at the University of Minnesota. So I'll tell you that story, but before I go there, let me give you a little more history of where I'm from. I grew up at the intersection between a mollisol and an alpha sol, two different soil types. I grew up in Otter Tail County, Fergus Falls, where you see the red dot there, right at the border between the prairies and broadleaf forests. So to me, that was fairly important where I grew up. Otter Tail County used to be the #1 county in the nation for growing oats. And in time, now Otter Tail County doesn't grow very many oats at all. In fact, what it does grow, and grow fairly well, are corn and soybeans. So what's caused that transition, and why has there been the change? So that's where I spent the first 18 years, 20 years of my life. Then I ended up in Eastern Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I was a Peace Corps volunteer there for a couple of years. And this was what it looked like. It was a high elevation, about a mile high in elevation, tropical rainforest, just off the equator. 2 meters of rain annually. Here's a fellow walking down the road with a regime of bananas on his head. This soil type, very different from where I grew up in Minnesota. This soil is volcanic derived, basaltic soil, very productive soil. Grows corn, it grows vegetables, fruits, bananas, cassava. You pretty much name the crop, it can grow it in this particular region. Yet people in this country and in this area were malnourished and stunted in their growth, at least some of them, a good portion. From this country, from that Peace Corps experience, I went back to University of Illinois and worked on a master's and PhD in agriculture, in agronomy. And for those of you who don't know what agronomy is the study of plants and soils, basically. And my particular study for my PhD involved looking at the effect of simulated acid rain on corn and soybean growth and production. And we did that with movable greenhouses, exclusion shelters that moved over the crops when ambient rainfall was happening. And then inside those greenhouses, we had irrigation systems set up to actually put on acid rain at varying acidity levels. So again, but this soil, if you see mollisol, deep, dark, very fertile. Very good for corn and soybeans, it turns out. From there, my first job was back to Africa and in Somalia, working on sorghum production. A lot of the people in Somalia still today are agropastoralists. Camels are their wealth storage. It's their bank. Was back then, still is today for a lot of people. Quite a different environment. So where am I going with all this? I haven't talked about agroecosystems, this kind of issues. Came back to the United States and worked in South Carolina for a few years. I've spent some time in Illinois, and for the last 18 years have been here in Minnesota. And the slide that you're looking at, shows two different versions of ecoregions in the state of Minnesota, or in the country, in the United States. Note that they don't look exactly alike, do they? Different people have defined ecoregions differently. But my background, primarily corn and soybeans, doing research on how to diversify away from the corn and soybean rotation. What alternative crops, what alternative cropping practices can be done, and also working with cover crops, specifically rye, is part of my background. In addition, for the last 13 years, I've been on the St. Paul campus, and I've taught a number of courses. And here's a list of courses. It's my one slide with bullet points, actually. And you can see the courses that I'm involved with deal with food production, world food problems, and agroecosystems. Agroecosystems of the world was a course that we've taught one time, and another course that I've been involved with for about 10 years now is a summer agroecosystem analysis field course, where students from the University of Minnesota go on an experiential learning opportunity for about 7 days, about a week. We go down to Iowa, we meet up with students from other universities, Iowa State, Nebraska, sometimes Penn State, Maine, and other places. And we go out to farms and we learn about the landscape in Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota, and Nebraska. So that experience, we asked the students to learn from farmers. They are the teachers in that particular class. And we say, we want you to understand that agroecosystem, why those farmers are doing what they're doing on their landscape. But still, I haven't defined an agroecosystem, have I? Let's go back and talk about terrestrial ecoregions. We can find maps. This one comes from the World Wildlife Fund that try to identify all the ecoregions of the world. And an ecoregion is a place that has similar plant species and animal species, similar sort of habitat. Note that if you look closely and try to drill in the lines, the boundaries between one ecoregion and another ecoregion are not well defined. It's a fairly diffuse boundary. Just like the earlier slide of the United States, different groups will define ecoregions slightly differently. But if we start with an ecoregion, what helps define an ecoregion? And these are some of the issues that I think really help define what makes an ecoregion. We have the rainfall is real important, the soil type, how the soil was derived, what it was derived from, hugely important. But other things like temperature, climate, latitude, elevation, all will drive what grows at that particular location in the world. So ecoregions can exist without humans. And oftentimes we'll study the environment, ecology, and we'll ignore the influence of humans. But if you add humans into the equation, humans are pretty good about trying to meet their needs for food, fiber, fuel, shelter. They create agroecosystems. And if you look around the world today, you'll note that, gee, there's agroecosystems just about everywhere. What's the most exotic agroecoregion that you've seen? Anybody want to venture a comment?
Biosphere 2.
Say it again?
Biosphere 2.
Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 is an agroecosystem. Yeah? That's a contained, closed system. Yeah. Another example of an ecoregion. That's good. Lobster fishery in Maine is another comment. Yeah, yeah. One more. How about close to home? Do we have an agroecosystem? Organic gardener. One gardener could be an that particular field. What about a whole big monoculture of corn, a field of corn? Is that an agroecosystem? Over time, that one field could be corn one year, soybeans the next, corn, soybean, corn, soybean. That might define an agroecosystem. It's man's influence on that ecoregion. So one of the issues is, what are the boundaries of an agroecoregion? And it depends on who's trying to identify it and who's trying to define it and analyze it. So my response to what are the boundaries of an agroregion, well, it's quite arbitrary. The Corn Belt might be considered an agroecosystem in itself. A particular farm might be considered an agroecosystem. Biosphere 2, agroecosystem. There's one fellow who uses the term holon. Bill Bland from the University of Wisconsin writes about holons. And he says that that is a whole in amongst itself, or it could be a part of a larger holon. And he'll use the term flickering between the holon being the whole and the part of the whole. This gets kind of techy, doesn't it? let's move away from kind of the techie talk about agroecosystems and talk about real life reality. I've mentioned some of the courses that I've taught, but I haven't mentioned all of the courses that I've taught. I want to focus here in a minute on some of the other courses that I think are more novel and interesting. But before we go there, let's look at one more agroecosystem that may help get away from this idea of boundary. Could we consider planet Earth an agroecosystem? Is it the ultimate agroecosystem? As far as we know, is a comment. Yeah. So here's a place, and all the inputs and all the outputs are kind of contained on that particular agroecosystem. Here comes the difficulty with boundaries. That still has inputs into it, doesn't it? It's got solar radiation, which really drives crop and plant growth. So if we define our agroecosystem as the planet Earth, we're still missing a big driver of the system. So keep that in mind. It just points out some of the difficulties of boundaries of agroecosystems. Let me now change gears totally and talk about an experiential learning activity that I was involved with. It started in 2009. Spring of 2009, I was going to join a group and ride my bicycle across the continent of Africa. 12,000 kilometers. It was going to take 4 months. I got a semester leave to do it, and I got paid to do it. Is my job great or what? But the caveat was I would teach a course about food and agriculture from Cairo to Cape Town, going about 10 miles an hour. And what I proposed to do was talk about agroecosystems every day to students using a satellite phone, using satellites, using a blog and a website where students could listen to what I would say daily about what I saw related to food and agriculture. So my agroecosystem that I was talking about pretty much daily was a synopsis of what I saw over that particular day's bicycle ride. I had 120 days in theory that I was going to talk to the students about the time of a semester from January through May. That was in theory. That's how it was going to work. I had a TA, Maggie Wagner, who helped me in 2009, and a specialist, Dr. Mary Brocky, helped me in 2010 because I didn't finish the ride in 2009. Actually, I got about halfway through a little town outside of Iringa in Tanzania, where I hit a pothole, a relatively big pothole, fell down, broke my arm, ended up having a compound fracture, having to have surgery. That cut that trip in 2009 short. Was back in the classroom the next week following the riders as they finished the ride, looking at their blogs, trying to look at agriculture that they were seeing from their eyes. So remember now what I'm trying to do is talk about food and agriculture, agroecosystems, daily as we went across Africa. I was no longer able to go across Africa, but we finished the classroom. The next year, 2010, I convinced my colleagues that it would be wise for me to finish that bicycle ride, start at the halfway point, start up in Nairobi, and go during the months of March, April, and May, and finish in May in South Africa. So that's what we did. Used the satellite phone. This was before the era of cell phone technology. Really, cell phones were not as ubiquitous as they are today. Even in 2009, there were lots of dead spots along the way in Africa. We were quite remote, quite rural. So I used the satellite phone both years. Had a very good experience. So much so that I was able to convince the University of Minnesota people that, wow, this was a good experience for me. Let's do it again in South America. So in 2011, I had the opportunity to go from Buenos Aires to Lima, talking again daily about agriculture as we went for about 2.5 months, about, 6,000 kilometers, a little over 6,000 kilometers. But this time, I had a class back on the St. Paul campus, just like before, but I also had 3 undergraduate students from Minnesota and 1 graduate student who wasn't really doing this for credit, accompanying me on this bicycle ride. Same group that helped sponsor the expedition was involved, a group called Tour d'Afrique. But the three undergraduate students got a full semester's worth of credit for this opportunity. 15 to 16 credits, depending on the courses they took. A couple of them I taught about agriculture and about culture. Of the 3 students, Evelyn, this person right here, was an incoming freshman at the time. The other 2 students have now graduated. The incoming freshman is now a junior and taking courses in food systems, changed her major. So this is, before we started, this is when we ended. Everybody's smiling except me. I'm tired. I've been with these students for 80-some days, and it was a great experience. A great experience for me. I think a great experience for the students to learn about agroecosystems, to be on the ground every day paying attention to the soil, the climate, the elevation, etc. So we blogged about this. We've got some websites, and you can find those websites and go back and look at those daily blogs if you're interested. But coming back to agroecosystems and those ecoregions that we showed earlier, in Africa, we went through about 36 different ecoregions. In South America, 16, at least according to this particular method of analyzing ecoregions. But again, in Africa, I was saying, okay, each day was an agroecosystem. I was trying to give a summary of what I learned and what we saw each particular day. So what did we see? We saw a lot of animal traction. Here, land preparation with animals in Ethiopia, in Chile, Tanzania. You know, there's more land prepared using animals for agriculture than there is land prepared using tractors worldwide. It's important to keep that in mind. Animal agriculture, very prevalent around the world. Land preparation in Malawi, another slide showing land preparation using animal traction in Bolivia. A very high elevation. So remember I talked about elevation being important, soils being important. Let's talk a little about elevation. This particular is graphic, way too much detail, way too many points, but let's bear with me. Way on the bottom line in the blue are the dates, January through, sorry, I'm not very good at moving this, through March in 2009, ended 2009, started up in 2010, halfway ended later in May. If we look at elevation, we see that from Cairo, we'll see if I can do this, from Cairo, we went over some mountain ranges or some hills, over to the Red Sea, went for a couple days along the Red Sea, and then back over that mountain range. And then all the way up until Khartoum, we followed the Nile River. Didn't gain a lot of elevation. Cairo to Khartoum is like going from Minneapolis to New Orleans, distance-wise. And elevation-wise, it's quite similar. Over here, I have the elevation of Minneapolis-St. Paul. You can see it's about where Khartoum is. The rest of the trip across Africa, we were at elevations much higher than Minneapolis-St. Paul. And our maximum elevation was around 11,000 feet. Keep that in mind. I'll show you the next slide will be the elevations that we have encountered in South America. 11,000 feet being the maximum here in Ethiopia. That's where we hit the highest mountains in Africa. Looking at South America, we were above 11,000 feet for 20 plus days in a row in Bolivia and parts of Peru. Hugely different crops, cropping systems, crop production, agroecosystems at those higher elevations. Right? The other thing to note is that we spent a lot of time near sea level down in Chile. We followed the coastline, remember. So big differences in elevation that relates to temperature. We went through the Atacama Desert in this part of Chile near the coast. That's the driest place in the world. Earlier in Africa, we went across parts of the Sahara. The Atacama is actually drier than the Sahara. I think I'll have a slide of agriculture in the Atacama. Before we go there, let's talk a little about irrigation. Irrigation is important in agriculture. It produces somewhere between 35 and 40% of all the food that humans consume, irrigated agriculture, but it's only on less than 20% of our total cropped acreage. So irrigated agriculture, hugely important. High elevations, this water was coming out of the mountains in the background. Here we see irrigated wheat from the Nile River. Here we see irrigated crops in Argentina, Namibia, and these are some produce up from irrigated land along the Nile near Cairo, Egypt. So irrigation, hugely important. Diversity of food crops. You can see a donkey cart here going into a market. This person produced all those crops on a very small acreage of land. More crops. Just look at the diversity of crops. Here we drop down into the Amazon basin during this trip. Industrial agriculture in the White Highlands of Kenya. Irrigated asparagus in Peru. Diversity of vegetables, fruits, Zambia. Potato planting, La Paz. Boy, this was in the Sahara Desert. What are those goats and sheep eating? They're finding plants somewhere. Wherever man tends to go, man tends to create agriculture or agroecosystems. We could ask the question, where have you been that you haven't seen man's influence in his efforts to get food, fiber, fuel, shelter? Talked about the Atacama Desert. This particular oasis, water's coming underground into this particular area. Water's very important for agriculture. Hugely important. Elevation, here's agriculture being done above the tree line, well above the tree line in Peru, or at the coast. Actually, fisheries was talked about earlier, lobsters in Maine, today's catch in Chile. Lake Titicaca, industrial type trout farm with lake trout from Canada being grown. Whoa, let's talk just a little bit about transportation. You can see the llama in front, the lady in the back, and the sheep up on top. And the sheep are alive, they're fine, they're just getting moved. But how do you get what you produce to market? Here we see people in Malawi moving their grain to market. Very laborious. Here we're passing corn stover in Peru. Here's a lady transporting corn stover. Cultures. What sort of cultures did we see? Lots of different cultures, lots of different experiences, languages. Anybody picked rock before? A few of you. Oh, sorry. Here are kids out in a field picking rocks. This is new agricultural land coming into production. That's quite intense, rocky field. Man, changing his environment, creating an agroecosystem. So one of my grad students wrote a grant, and this past summer we did a different activity with 6 graduate students. We decided to look at the state of Minnesota closer and involve high school students. And so what we did is we biked or ran across the state of Minnesota east-west. Took us 6 days, 190 miles, followed basically Highway 7. Started in a little town, Marietta, ended up just past Stillwater. The students went into the high schools and talked about agriculture from various perspectives during this. What did they see during that activity? What a way for them to experience the landscape. And what a great experience for me to be involved with those students and to hear their stories and see their perceptions of the landscape. So here's a picture of some of us taken by Brian Ronk, who was one of the support people at the border in Wisconsin in early May. What did we see in early May? What would we have seen had we done it a different time of the year? But let me go back. I've got only a few more slides, a few more minutes. I want to touch base back on something I'm very interested in now, and that's understanding what can be done in the country of Somalia. And I'm working with a group called SATG, Somali Ag Technical Group, which now is based out of Kenya. And when they started up in Kenya, they decided to change their name for the Kenyan government and paperwork to Filson, which is actually a Somali word meaning hope for the future. It's also the name of the mung bean variety that Adna Soble helped identify. And here, the 3 people here are 3 of the 5 board members of that particular group. This photo was taken a couple of years ago in Minneapolis, and if you can read Somali, you would be able to say you'd be able to read what it says, and it's something about agriculture, doing agriculture intervention back in Somalia. But when I was in Somalia, in Somaliland back in January, this is what a farmer showed us. He said, "This is food aid corn. Would you eat this corn?" And that was quite a challenge to me to look at that. Turns out we took a sample of this corn, we analyzed it, and we found high levels of a mycotoxin, high enough levels so that it's poisonous to kids and to adults. So we've got a small grant to look at 50 additional samples of this food aid maize to understand, is it a widespread problem or not? We don't really have the results back yet, but indications are still out. We don't know. That's one issue. Another issue, more recently, in August, I was able to go to Nairobi, work with the people that you saw in that earlier slide on a report doing an assessment of economic growth in South Central Somalia. And during this particular trip, heard a story. I wasn't actually in Somalia, but I heard a story and got a couple of slides from my colleague Hussein. And what he would see in one particular farm location were bags of food aid maize, yellow maize, that these bags would be given basically to IDPs, internally displaced people, who would turn around and sell it because they don't really like yellow maize unless they're really hungry. They would sell these bags back onto the market and take the cash and buy other food with the cash. So the question becomes, what happens to all these bags of food aid maize that are being sold back onto the market? And it's an interesting story. It's a long story, but this is where it's ending up as feed for camels. And the camels are then milked, and the milk is sold in the Mogadishu market. So food aid ending up as feed, ending up as milk. Aggregate that agroecosystem. Try to figure that out. Try to define the boundaries of this particular effort. That's kind of where I'm at now and where I'll spend some time in my future. So aggregating an agroecosystem. I hope you've seen that man has a huge influence everywhere we go. We create agroecosystems. Defining them can be a bit tricky. They're important. We know they have an impact on our planet. We need to pay attention to them.